Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our event this morning. I'm Francisco Rosari Jr. of the University of the Philippines Department of Linguistics. Today's lecture is part of the series of events in celebration of the centennial anniversary of the department and in honor of its very first chair, Trinidad Pardo de Tavera. This event is also in partnership with the Filipinas Heritage Library, the other half of Ayala Foundation's Arts and Culture Division. For those who are tuned in, this event is being live streamed on the official Facebook page and YouTube channel of the UP Department of Linguistics. You may type your questions and feedback in the respective comment sections of these platforms, and we will try to address them later during the discussion. Okay, so to formally open the event, we have the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Philosophy, Dr. María Bernadette Abrera.
Thank you. And magandang umaga sa lahat at isang malaking pagbati sa Departamento ng Linguistics na nagdiriwang ng kanyang sentenaryo ngayong taon. Naging bahagi ito ng College of Liberal Arts na siya namang pinagmulan ng kasalukuyan nating College of Social Sciences and Philosophy. At itinatag ang departamento para sa siyentipikong pag-aaral, pangangalaga at pagtataguyod ng mga wikang Pilipino sa pamamagitan ng pagtuturo, pananaliksik at publikasyon na siya namang nagbunga sa isang mayabong na extension program. Halimbawa, nung pumasok tayo sa panahon ng COVID-19 noong 2020, sumulong ang departamento sa pamamagitan ng language warriors upang ipaunawa at ipaliwanag ang mga katagang pampandemya sa iba't ibang wikang Pilipino. The department has definitely gone beyond its original mandate and has become the primary center for the study and archiving of Philippine languages and dialects and has contributed to the theoretical studies and the identification and solutions of language problems, and towards the teaching of Asian languages. Today we are gathered to honor a Filipino who was a medical doctor, but being a nationalist, became engaged and passionate in the study and promotion of language, and actively published in both fields, and even served as the first chair of the Department of Linguistics. We celebrate the centenary of the Department of Linguistics. While linguistics breaks down language in parts to analyze it as a code of communication, the department, in its comprehensive work, also shows us that language is only the starting point, that in the articulation of similarities and differences, we find the beginning of our understanding of our culture and our past. In the end, language leads us to a journey into transcendence and what lies beyond it. Congratulations to the Department of Linguistics. We are proud of its committed staff and faculty members. May you have another fruitful 100 years and beyond. Mabuhay!
Maraming salamat po, Dean Abrera. We also have Dr. John B. Labella, the head of the Filipinas Heritage Library, to give us a short message.
Congratulations to the University of the Philippines Department of Linguistics, celebrating 100 years since its founding in 1922. And welcome everyone to this talk by Mercedes Planta on Th. Pardo de Tavera. In 2000, Ayala Foundation and Filipinas Heritage Library republished an English edition of Plantas Medicinales, first translated in 1907 by Jerome Thomas Jr. For the new edition, the foundation commissioned the botanical painter Emmanuel Cordoba to provide plant illustrations, and our speaker today will feature a few of these images. Dr. Planta's talk is truly inspiring in that it affirms the life of languages. This life of languages is deeply relevant not just to linguistics but also to our library. Here is a book that holds the seeds of modern botanical research in the Philippines and merges them with Philippine local traditions. And readers who are interested to read the book in Spanish can visit the FHL and access the 1892 edition of Plantas Medicinales. Pardo de Tavera's work affirms the survival of local knowledge in various languages and of native medicinal tools. The plant names he collects animates our sense of place, a sense of the world we inhabit, and hence our love of country as a green abode. I truly love also the way this talk affirms life itself, healing of bodies, as we turn a page in our country, approaching what we hope to be life beyond the pandemic. How auspicious it is indeed for UP Linguistics to gather us around a book about healing. More power to MERS Planta, and more power to our creative partners at UP Linguistics.
Thank you very much, Dr. John. All right, so our speaker this morning is Dr. María Mercedes Planta. She is a professor of history at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. She is the author of The Traditional Medicine in the Colonial Philippines, 16th to the 19th Century, which garnered the Best Book in Science Award by the National Book Awards of the Philippines in 2018. She currently holds an honorary appointment as visiting fellow of the Australian National University and is the current chair of the History and Geography Section, Social Sciences Division, National Research Council of the Philippines. In 2019, she earned the title University Scientist of the University of the Philippines System, a distinction that recognizes and supports the development of science and technology and encourages and rewards scientific productivity. He is currently the deputy director or the deputy editor of the Regional Journal of the Southeast Asian Studies, an international peer-reviewed journal that seeks to provide a platform for Southeast Asian scholars based in Southeast Asia to share their research internationally. So members, good morning and thank you for joining us.
Good morning. I want to thank the Department of Linguistics for inviting me to be part of this event, as I also congratulate them for celebrating their 100 years anniversary. I also want to thank uh, Dr. John Labella of the Filipinas Heritage Library and the staff for joining the Department of Linguistics and me in celebrating 100 years of the anniversary of the founding of the Department of Linguistics. Today, I will talk about the first chair, the first chair of the Department of Linguistics, Trinidad Pardo de Tavera. The title of my talk is Man of His Time, Man Ahead of His Time. Trinidad Pardo de Tavera, 1857 to 1925, premier Filipino Filipinist. My talk will, next slide please. My talk will center on the work of Trinidad Pardo de Tavera, Plantas Medicinales de Filipinas, but I will introduce him in a very to give you an overview of his work and his life in order that we may fully appreciate him and his contributions to the study of Philippine history and Philippine studies in general. Next slide, please. So the focus of my talk is his work, 1892, Plantas Medicinales de Filipinas, which is a book on Philippine traditional medicinal plants and herbs that Pardo de Tavera had personally collected. Some of these plants were personally tried by him. This was a work commissioned by the Spanish government at that time. But what is interesting about this work is that Plantas Medicinales de Filipinas was not only a work that was made by a man trained in the science of medicine, but was also someone who wanted to focus not just on the scientific value of the plants, but on the cultural aspects of this world of healing of the Filipinos. Next slide, please. This is a photo of Trinidad Pardo de Tavera. He was born in 1857, died in 1925, and he is a mestizo, a Spanish mestizo. Next slide, please. Um, this is Pardo de Tavera. This is a painting by Juan Luna, The Blood Compact, and Rizal, together with Trinidad Pardo de Tavera, became models of Juan Luna's painting on the Blood Compact. Trinidad Pardo de Tavera, because he was very Spanish looking, was is the center of this painting. Next slide, please. This is a photo of the family of Trinidad Pardo de Tavera in Paris. This is him. Next slide, please. This is a genealogy of the Pardo de Tavera family. So very briefly, we can see here, Trinidad Pardo de Tavera had a brother. But what is interesting, both brothers, his uncle, Felix Pardo de Tavera, and Joaquin Pardo de Tavera, who was his uncle, married the sisters, the Gorricho sisters. So at the age of 17, Pardo de Tavera's father passed away, and he lived with his uncle Joaquin. Next slide, please. The work of the life of Pardo de Tavera is one that is almost unbelievable, because at a very young age, he was already living in Paris. He lived in Paris because his uncle, Joaquin Pardo de Tavera, was driven into exile for his involvement in the Cavite Mutiny. His uncle, Joaquin Pardo de Tavera, was identified by the Spaniards as a major factor in the coming together of Filipinos in what was considered to be the birth of a coming together, or the birth of nationalism in the Philippines, the Cavite Mutiny in 1872. As a result, his uncle was exiled to the Marianas Islands for 4 years and was prohibited from ever coming back to the Philippines. That's why Pardo de Tavera, right after finishing his college degree from the Ateneo de Manila at that time, and enrolling for 2 years only at the UST at the College of Medicine, had to leave for Paris. So in Paris, Pardo de Tavera enrolled as a medical student. He finished his AB degree in 1873. By 1875, he finished 2 years at the UST College of Medicine. By 1875, he went to Paris to join the family of his uncle, and became who then was his ward. By 1880, he received his licentiate as a doctor. By 1881, he obtained his medical license. He became a fully fledged medical doctor. Pardo de Tavera lived in the 19th century Paris. That when you read the biography written about him by Resil Mujares, 19th century Paris was considered or described to be the capital, intellectual capital at that time, as well as the center of art. The period of Pardo de Tavera's time in Paris was characterized as the height of French liberalism. French liberalism at that time was very keen on pushing for representative government. It was a time of the battle between religion and science. It was the time that Pardo de Tavera found himself in the company of many scientists who were famous in their own field. At the time, Paris was the center of the development in science brought about by the work of Robert Koch, who is considered to be the father of modern bacteriology for his discovery of the germs, particularly of tuberculosis germs, or the cause of tuberculosis. At the time of Koch, there was also Louis Pasteur, who was who was credited with having been able to discover the first vaccine that was intended for cholera, and he was considered a father of immunology. At this time, um, Pardo's company was not only limited to scientists, he also had the chance to. He was very keen on the developments in Russia because of his friendship with some Russians who were actually nihilists at the time. And Pardo de Tavera did not see anything wrong with nihilism. And in fact, it was this friendship with the Russian nihilists that paved the way for his broader interest on the developments in Russia. By 1885, when he finished, or about 4 years, when he finished his medical degree, he enrolled and obtained a diploma in the Malay language discipline. In 1881, at the time that he was trying to get into the language school in Paris, he also wrote on Pott's disease. And this is considered to be one of the first work he wrote as a medical doctor. In 1885, he would write his Plantas Medicinales de Filipinas. Prior to his writing of the Plantas Medicinales de Filipinas, he wrote in 1893 Noticias sobre la imprenta y el grabado en Filipinas. For many of us, um, at first glance, the book is only about the identification of the beginning of printing in the Philippines. For Pardo, the beginning of printing in the Philippines began in 1610 with Gutenberg instead of the woodblock printed Doctrinas in 1593. However, what is significant about this book is not that it is about the beginnings of printing in the Philippines, but as a whole, and starting with this work, Pardo de Tavera made a commitment that every intellectual undertaking he would make would always be about the Philippines and how to discover Philippine society, Philippine culture, and how to portray it in its own terms. So this book may be about printing, but it was also very political because by this work, Pardo de Tavera showed how the Spaniards had actually controlled publication and the circulation of knowledge in the Philippines by the act of printing as a state mechanism to regulate knowledge in the country. So this gathered a lot of controversy, especially from among the Spanish officials in the country at that time. So um, he wrote in his memoirs, in his letters, that printing in the Philippines under Spain was an instrument at the hands of the state and of religion, something that he was very opposed to from the beginning, that he became a more mature scholar. Next slide, please. This is another work that Pardo de Tavera wrote in 1884. This with the beginnings of printing in the previous slide and this work, these are all generally about language. But every single work that Pardo de Tavera had undertaken at the time, again, was also very academic, very scholarly, but also very political. This work is a study on Philippine paleography to highlight that Filipinos had their own pre-colonial writing system. Um, he was behind the impetus to push for the changes in Filipino orthography, K and W instead of C and U, to conform to the proper physiognomy of Tagalog. So by this description that you can see on the slide, the work is very scholarly. But in this same work, Pardo de Tavera argued that the Filipino alphabet, which is called baybayin, is not a Spanish invention, or the word baybayin is not derived from Spanish, but rather it's a very Filipino thing. So by that assertion, Pardo de Tavera was already making a position that the alphabets of the Filipinos is a system of learning that Filipinos had crafted on their own without Spanish intervention. Um, Next slide, please. This one is my favorite work of all the works on language that Pardo de Tavera had made, El Sanscrito de la Lengua Tagalog. This work shows affinities of Tagalog with other Asian languages, particularly Sanskrit. This is my favorite not because I understand Sanskrit, but because of how Pardo de Tavera had argued for this book and for the Sanskrit as a strong influence, not only in Philippine languages, but he pushed for the dominance of one period of Philippine history. One part of the Philippine archipelago was actually dominated by the Hindus, something that is quite um, unimaginable in 21st century Philippines, because when you look at the region of Southeast Asia, the Philippines has the least visible Indian influence, particularly for countries located in the maritime region of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, most particularly. Um, but not only is the argument for the influence of Sanskrit in Tagalog languages significant, what is significant is the kind of language, is the kind of influence that the Indians had brought to the Philippines. Pardo de Tavera claims to be anti-Chinese, but the anti-Chinese sentiment was largely cultivated under Spanish auspices because of how the Spaniards had viewed the Chinese, especially in the beginning of Spanish rule in the country. But this work may not necessarily be anti-Spanish. But when you get that idea or that insight on Pardo de Tavera's thinking, his argument here that Spanish or Chinese influences in the Philippines is very ordinary. It is ordinary in terms that the language is reflected on the food, on how we address our siblings, on local terms, on very ordinary terms. However, he argued that Indian influence in the Philippines is more superior because our political system, and he cited the word Raja, is actually very Indian. So that's a very interesting insight for me. Um, Next slide, please. This one also looks very safe. This is a bibliography of the Philippines, Biblioteca Filipina. It consists of 2,850 entries on the history, ethnography, linguistics, botany, zoology, history of publishing, and bibliography in the Philippines, published in 1903. However, this Biblioteca Filipina contains annotations of Pardo de Tavera that I have to share with you to give you a sense of how he was as not just as a scholar, but also as a person. So in Biblioteca Filipina, he included some works and made commentaries of these works. And the comments are very interesting. For Cipriano Marsilia, who wrote on Estudios de los Antiguos Alfabetos Filipinas in 1895, this is what Pardo de Tavera had to say about him. Cipriano Marsilia does not understand a word of matters paleographic. And another work by Manuel Buzeta, this one is quite famous, especially for history majors like me. Manuel Buzeta wrote Grammatica de Lengua Tagala in 1850. And this is what Pardo de Tavera said about him, or about the book rather. It is not easy to find a plagiarism more shameless and foolish. So by these comments, we know that Pardo de Tavera is not only a scholar by his work, but also he was someone who never hesitated to to tell anyone or everyone what he thinks at any particular time. Next slide, please. So actually, when I was reading about this, it was quite entertaining. In the period of American rule, Pardo de Tavera got a lot of flack because On the one hand, he was very forward-looking. He thought about population and the growing population of the Filipinos and how that cannot be sustainable. And he was a subject of article in the Free Press, Pity the Picaninis, Pobrecitos Pecaninis. Pecaninis is a black child, so this is about Filipinos and how he ridiculed Filipinos in general, even those government officials, because of the many children that they had. So if you can zoom in on this, you will see that Sergio Osmeña has 10 children, Gregorio Araneta has 12, and they're all asking him, paano ako? How about me? Parang, am I a pobrecito? But if Gregorio Araneta had 12 children, Sergio Osmeña had 10. No one can beat Isabelo de los Reyes, who had 24 children. So, next slide, please. So, anyone at this time, this is a very famous quote by Pardo de Tavera: a civilized man should not have any children at all. Medyo extreme. So, but what insight can be drawn from this event? Um, in the early 1900s, Pardo de Tavera already knew the impact of population explosion in the country. For him, it is not about just the quantity of or the number of people that matters. It is about the kind of citizen that the Filipino people will breed. Next slide, please. So this is an article that you can easily access in the Free Press collection. Okay, next slide, please. So again, this is about how Pardo de Tavera, at this time, he was already opposed to Filipinization. Pardo de Tavera is a known anti-Filipino in the sense that he believed we can never make it on our own. That the best thing for the Philippines was to be an American protectorate and be part of the American states. He believed that the English language was at the root of Philippine progress. And these beliefs of Pardo de Tavera were beliefs that were honed over the years of his many scholarly engagements and his own training. Next slide, please. So this is just one of the articles that I wanted to show you. Okay, next slide, please. And next slide, please. This is Isabelo de los Reyes. Isabelo de los Reyes is one of the individuals who constitutes the brains of the nation in Resil Mujares' very important work. Biographical work on Isabelo de los Reyes, Trinidad Pardo de Tavera, and Pedro Paterno. In this article, Isabelo de los Reyes made a reply or answered, wrote about the commotion that Pardo de Tavera had brought about because of his declarations on how it is to become a civilized man or not, and how children were a part of that qualification of civilization. But Isabelo de los Reyes, unlike his peers such as Sergio Osmeña and Gregorio Araneta, did not take Pardo de Tavera literally. In fact, he said he understood where Pardo de Tavera was coming from, and he knew that Pardo de Tavera meant that it was not about having children only. The entire exercise and declaration of Pardo de Tavera was about him saying that you shouldn't have any or more children than you can properly care for. So that was at least the reply of Isabelo de los Reyes. Next slide, please. This is now the work that I am going to talk about, the heart of my talk. But when I first saw this book, I read the preface. The book, Plantas Medicinales de Filipinas, originally published in 1892 in Spanish. It had a translation in 1905, and the translation was made by Jerome Thomas, an American who was part of the American contingent in the U.S. Army. This book this one, the middle part, is the book that Ayala Foundation had republished in 1892. And this is the most accessible copy. I have a copy of this book. When I read the Plantas Medicinales de Filipinas, this book contains both the original Spanish and the English text. It opens with the English text, and you will see the preface of Trinidad Pardo de Tavera. In that preface, Trinidad Pardo de Tavera, or Jerome Thomas, wrote that translated the Spanish version of Pardo de Tavera. In the translation, Pardo de Tavera was made to say that the plants that he collected for this book were intended to be brought to Paris, where there was more equipment to test their scientific merits, and to subject the plants for further scientific examination. However, the care of the shipment of these plants was um, entrusted to an inexperienced person who made actually Jerome Thomas wrote, the stupid mistake of putting the plants together with other succulent plants that led to the decomposition of the entire collection, to the point that Pardo de Tavera, the specimens that he painstakingly accumulated did not perish. And over time, Pardo de Tavera would lament that he never recovered any of those specimens that he had accumulated because of that one mistake. So when I read the the English text, it struck me, why would someone say stupid? I mean, so I looked at the original text, and really the text in the original, it read a una persona inexperta. So that one is quite okay, an inexperienced person, que hizo la torpeza de poner. Torpeza means like foolish, but knowing Pardo de Tavera, he would probably really say estupido. That is really what he wanted to say, and Jerome Thomas translated it that way. Probably Jerome Thomas really knew Pardo de Tavera to not even consider, trying to be polite in using his language. Okay, so Plantas Medicinales de Filipinas was commissioned by the Spanish government in 1892. This was the gold standard for this kind of work in the entire Spanish period until the 20th century, when the Americans came up with studies of this kind um, under American rule. What is Plantas Medicinales de Filipinas? Plantas Medicinales de Filipinas was a work that Pardo de Tavera assembled for a trained doctor. It is not usual that at that time, especially in the 19th century, that one would spend time to look at the practices of traditional medical healers. And those practice of healing revolved around medicinal plants that herbolarios, or traditional medical healers in the Philippines, were using as part of their armamentarium. But the purpose of Plantas Medicinales de Filipinas was not only about documenting, collecting, and verifying this knowledge of traditional medicinal healers who were Filipinos, but also to present a scientific treatise that adhered to the scientific standards of the 19th century, but at the same time very keen on 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 showing an aspect of Filipino culture that many individuals, Spanish and Americans at that time, would never have thought about. And this was done by a medical doctor. That makes it even more special at the height when there was always the contest between religion and science. And Pardo de Tavera was very scientific. He took time, and he devoted time to work on this subject. What is interesting also is that the collection in this work includes plants that Pardo de Tavera had tested on himself, and I will show you later. Overall, Pardo de Tavera always declared that he was more Filipino than any other Filipino, because all of his works were dedicated um, to elevating Filipino culture, to to making sure that Filipinos were not misinterpreted or portrayed in light of colonialism that intends to diminish the Filipino worth or the worth of the Filipino for that matter. Okay, next slide, please. Here is the original text of Pardo de Tavera, where he says that the methods of the Spanish of the Filipino traditional medical practitioners were actually very scientific. Um, Jerome Thomas provided a translation, which I have also included here. Next slide, please. This is the translation. Some physicians uh, wrote Pardo de Tavera, regard with small favor the therapeutic application of plants by Filipino herb doctors as being entirely empirical. This is unjustified because in all the most rational and scientific remedies that we make use of, the first step towards a final development of their relative position among remedies is due to empiricism, which is founded on daily experience, on observation of results obtained in specific cases, facts that are handed down from father to son for generations. The rest of the text is highlighted in yellow because this translation was done by a good friend, my good friend Wistan de la Peña, and I used this translation rather than the Jerome Thomas translation because this is more fitting. So the scientific explanation is lacking in Wistan de la Peña translated is it as not available. But those first ideas, frequently owing their origins to chance or perhaps to superstition, has often been based upon the observation of facts or phenomena for Wisdom de la Peña, which are nonetheless positive or are not necessarily invalid. So, Pardo de Tavera in 1892, at the height of the triumph of science and medicine over tradition, despite his training and his personal disposition that he was very scientific, cared to assert this fact about Filipino traditional medicine. Next slide, please. These are some of the interesting things that Pardo de Tavera had included in the text. Plantas Medicinales de Filipinas is not the first work of its kind. Spanish missionaries already uh, managed to assemble a lot of work on medicinal plants in the Philippines. In fact, one of the most famous from where this plate was taken is the work of Manuel Blanco, Flora de Filipinas. However, what is significant about Pardo de Tavera's work was not only that he um, cleaned up the scientific name of the species that were included in Plantas Medicinales. He also included the botanical descriptions and their uses, but he also included how these plants were used in many different communities. So, for instance, this is the Makahia. The scientific name, I have already updated the scientific name here. The Makahia is interesting because look at my slide. Traditionally, this is used as an expectorant. So, for Filipinos, this is useful for cough, I suppose. But in India, and I included this because the description is very cute. The virtue of the makahia, it is a plant that closes whenever you touch it. That's why probably the name is makahia. However, for the Indians in South Asia, this quality of the makahia is interesting. It's not only interesting, but quite miraculous. And they associated the makahia as a plant that actually restores virginity for women. So those things were included in Pardo de Tavera's text. Next slide, please. This is coffee, very common for many of us, but not common because not common in the sense that Linnaeus, who originated the scientific nomenclature form of identifying plants, described this as an aphrodisiac. What is interesting about Plantas Medicinales, the Filipinas, is not that the Linnaeus, the comment of Linnaeus was included, but Pardo de Tavera actually rebutted it by citing it cannot be an aphrodisiac because the Arabs um, take this drink regularly. They are far from being a group of people who are supposed to have to be um, to 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 get that quality of being an aphrodisiac. In the Philippines, it is considered to stimulate the central cerebral function and circulation. Um, okay, next slide, please. Here is the ilang-ilang. The I chose the ilang-ilang. We are quite familiar with it. It has a very nice smell. Traditionally, ilang-ilang is used for cholera. To boil the leaves of the ilang-ilang is a is a is a cure for cholera. However, we probably will be happy, or we will be interested to know that the patent for the ilang-ilang tree as a perfume has been taken by YSL. So probably most of us don't realize that. And that patent has been with YSL for the longest time, probably more than 100 years old, I suppose. Next slide, please. Here is the Dita plant. The Dita plant is significant. It is for fever, traditionally for chronic diarrhea in dysentery, but this is significant because Pardo de Tavera tried it for himself as a cure for malaria. Um, I included the example of the Dita plant here because the Dita in the Philippines has to be carefully identified. The Dita here is medicinal, but there is another kind of Dita that has no medicinal properties. Rather, it is used as a weapon to poison the tip of arrows. What needs to be remembered in the example of the Dita is that the work of Pardo de Tavera is far from being over, or Plantas Medicinales de Filipinas is far from being a definitive work. By the example of the Dita, specifically, this work invites us to study or discover more of the plant medicines that traditional Filipinos have been using. Okay, next slide, please. Here, I put together the bonga and the ikmo. On their own, the bonga and the ikmo have their own medicinal properties. So, the ikmo, for instance, is very important for stomach problems for children. It is recorded that it has a particular use for infants. Um, the bonga is a main ingredient for the mama or the betel chewing. In traditional Philippine society and in traditional Southeast Asian societies, the ikmo and the bonga constitute a ritual that carries many meanings. For instance, in in his column, Ambeto Campo wrote about betel chewing as the precursor of people coming together to gather in Starbucks, for example, because coffee brings them together. I have to cite the Starbucks example, but in the nakakatawa lang. But in traditional Philippine society, prior to coffee or Starbucks for that matter, people gather to chew betel. Um, what is significant about betel is that um, it is so much a part of the lives of traditional Filipinos and Southeast Asians. We believe that betel chewing can protect you from stomach problems brought about probably by drinking unclean water. In Southeast Asia, there are betel nut boxes of many different kinds. But it is not that there are betel nut boxes only. It is that betel nut boxes are valued not because they are nice boxes only, but because of what they mean. Betel nut boxes hold these this these elements for betel chewing, and they are considered valuable enough to be part of a dowry. Many years ago, and I always tell this to my students, I don't remember where I've read it, but um, in traditional Southeast Asian society, spitting is how you spit, or the distance of your spit is an indication of your position in society. So, for instance, um, betel chewing uh, um makes one salivate, so you need to spit it out. But in that context of spitting as a form of declaring your social position. So when you chew betel, for instance, I tell my students inside the classroom, if we are into betel chewing, I would spit from betel chewing, from chewing betel, and I can spit as far as I want to spit because I am the most superior individual in this classroom. But students can only spit in the small spittoon if they have one, or can spit beside them or very near to where they are because they don't have any position in the environment of the classroom. But more importantly, it is also interesting that betel chewing is also related to concepts of beauty. In traditional Southeast Asian societies, beauty, today, beauty is equated with white teeth. But in traditional Southeast Asian societies, uh, you can't have white teeth because you need to distinguish yourself from animals. So people would deliberately blacken their teeth or chew betel for them to have colored teeth. Colored teeth, the more colored it is, the more one is beautiful or pretty. Okay, next. Um, the luya is cited by Pardo de Tavera primarily as a condiment. Although the purpose is for flatulent colic, so siguro anything about the tummy. However, luya now is very significant because of its medicinal properties. It is considered to have anti-cancer properties in the 21st century. Next slide, please. This is the sambong. Today, this is one plant endorsed by the Department of Health as a health supplement for bronchitis, but also for urinary stones. Traditionally, although I have not encountered the sambong described as such for urinary stones, for kidney, probably. Oh, probably for kidney. So traditionally, it is used for urinary stones or for kidney problems, but also for bronchitis. Next slide, please. The Lagundi is significant because now it's very famous for cough. In the period of the COVID pandemic, the Lagundi was considered to be a possible um, uh, mediating cure for those with mild cases of COVID. But these three plants altogether, the Lagundi, the Sambong, and the Luya, are all recognized by the Department of Health in the beginning in the 20th century through the work of Juan. And the last slide, please, for this is the gumamela. The gumamela is a very common plant for many of us. It is considered to be by Pardo de Tavera as a cure for inflammation. However, traditionally in Philippine society, this has a special value for women because those who suffer from menstrual cramps are supposed to get relief from the boiled leaves and flower of the gumamela. Next slide, please. Padre de Tavera is a man whose intellectual output outweighs anyone until the 21st century, even now in the 21st century. The range of Padre de Tavera's work and the diversity and the quality is altogether are products of a committed scholar, well trained in the tradition, scientific tradition of the West, but whose works, no matter how diverse, are all rooted in his desire to discover Philippine society, Philippine culture, and ways of life for the Filipino, that we Filipinos can derive pride in knowing ourselves through our culture. In 1925, Pardo de Tavera passed away, and this is one. In that period, in 1925, he was already considered or described as the foremost scholar the Philippines ever had. Ferdinand Blumentritt, that we are probably very familiar with because of his association with Rizal, identified Pardo de Tavera and Rizal as the only two scholars that Spain had ever produced in 333 years of Spanish rule. However, now when I come to think about it, probably Rizal is also, well, we cannot dispute the role of Rizal in Philippine history, but in terms of academic output and the impact of his work, I think it is Pardo de Tavera more than Jose Rizal. Next slide, please. So these are all tributes for Pardo de Tavera. I close my lecture by saying that title of this work, A Man of His Time, Man Ahead of His Time, Pardo de Tavera, when I crafted that title, I was thinking that by the title, I am placing Pardo de Tavera in a particular context because of who he was, his impact, and how he was perceived by his peers during his time. But now that I have gone over Pardo de Tavera's work, I suppose he does not need to be qualified. Pardo de Tavera is just the premier Filipino Filipinist that does not who does not need to be qualified as a man of his time or a man ahead of his time. Thank you.
All right, so thank you very much, members, for that very interesting lecture, very insightful and informative, especially about the influence of the Chinese in our language. Like what you've said, it's reflected in the common and ordinary aspects of our lives, um, like the unlike Sanskrit, like the Indian influence, where we um, see terms, more superior terms, for example, very political, like words like Raja or Tadhana, I mean, Bighani in Il Sanskrito. And also his comments on overpopulation, and as you said, the impact of overpopulation and the kind of citizen that the Filipinos will breed. Um, it's also interesting to hear about Filipino traditional plants and medicine and how he used this, okay, to portray the Filipino society, its civilization, being scientific on par with scientific knowledge in the West. And you also mentioned something about his position on Philippinization. And well, I guess this is a controversial take, especially for the hardcore nationalists. So, what's your take on that issue?
Um, uh, Even during his time, Pardo de Tavera was already controversial because of his position, but not just because of his political position, but also because of how he articulated that position. You know,
Mhm.
when I read out the comments he made on the Spanish authors, those were really, when you read them, but when we read the text, it is always, we always enjoy the text that we choose, but we exceptionally enjoy the text that we read when they are as animating
Mhm.
as the comments of Pardo de Tavera. I mean, I will read to you again because I just cannot get over it. You know how they describe Buseta. It's not easy to find a plagiarist
Mhm.
more shameless and foolish. He never minces words.
Mhm.
His take on Filipinization um, was made as a political position, not just as a political position that he believed English was good for us. He believed that by learning the English language, we will develop industry, the the regard for labor. Um, we will we will have values of hard work and rationality and reason, and we will be more scientific, which are all elements of how we can progress as a nation. But the way he articulated his his anti-Filipinization stand was a different matter. For him,
Mhm.
Filipinos do not deserve to be independent
Mhm.
because we don't have the means to be independent. And
Mhm.
he cited our population, even the best of us. He cited all those politicians did not did not deserve to be called civilized because they have just so many children. So it was one thing that he was anti-Filipinist. It was another that he expressed those sentiments in very brutal terms. So I suppose people regard him. Um, they were very wary of Pardo de Tavera because they never knew what's going to come out of his mouth. He never minces words. And
Mhm.
add to that was he was very accomplished. So the power of his words plus his accomplishments makes one hesitate to get into his bad side, I think. But his anti-Filipinization stand was a very academic position, very scholarly position. It was not just about having no faith in the Filipinos, but it was about finding a way for the Philippines to develop. And the way was to embrace the Anglo-Saxon civilization. He was also called the ultimate Sahonismo fan, the fan of Anglo-Saxon. That I think that is how I read that um, uh, aspect of Palo de Tavera.
Okay, so in relation to that question, we have this question from one of our viewers. So, how can we reignite a nuanced interest in Pardo de Tavera's work in this polarized age where personalities tend to be painted as all good or all bad?
Uh, Many of us would always, most of the time, will be interested to learn more about an individual or an event if they are pleasing.
Mhm.
That's why um, we, we want to discover Filipino ways of life. That's why the medicinal plants that Pardo de Tavera listed are very interesting. I
Mhm.
mean, all of a sudden, makahiya takes on a different a different meaning, especially for me. I mean, I whether that is true or not, but to rediscover Pardo de Tavera requires an open mind or a
Mhm.
conviction that don't one as an academic or scholars or anyone who loves to read, one must never be swayed by difficult personalities. Most of the time, Pardo de Tavera, we listen to people saying that Pardo de Tavera is a traitor to the nation for his pursuit of
Mhm.
English language and Anglo-Saxon civilization. But we must try to discover what is at the root of it all. When you read his own writings, he would always repeatedly say, "I am more Filipino than anyone else. All
Mhm.
my work, all my labor is devoted to knowing the Philippines and the Filipino people and to take out all the bad impressions on the Filipino that the Spaniards had heaped on this country by their own scholarly works. And so he begins to cite all these Spanish scholars who have diminished the Filipinos who have diminished the Filipinos, um, not only in Spanish eyes but also on Filipino eyes. But that is probably a difficult thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. Like some historians or some people label him as a traitor to the nation. And yes, we have diverse audience right now, we're including high school students. So siguro paano natin yun I think parang we need to emphasize that, no? Kasi merong ganoong perception or notion about Pardo de Tavera and yung nga yung pagiging traitor to the nation. So paano natin yun maipapaintindi halimbawa sa mga high school students who are watching us right now na nandun pa rin yung pagiging nationalistic ni Pardo de Tavera sa kabila noong ganoong mga controversial position dito sa usapin na ito.
Masasabi ko lang ay ang mga high school student natin, even our students not just in high school, we need to have a different kind of mindset. The mindset that we want to discover Philippine history, Philippine culture and society. And that discovery entails a conscious effort to have access to the right, to have access to materials to good quality reading materials. I think.
Yeah. Especially now na nandito tayo sa panahon ng misinformation, disinformation.
When you read about Pardo de Tavera, and especially in the period of Spanish rule, Pardo de Tavera in the period of American rule, Pardo de Tavera was at the height of the campaign for Philippine independence. And he, even before the Americans set foot officially, properly in the Philippines, Pardo de Tavera was already talking to them. That's why he was appointed as Philippine commissioner. But Pardo de Tavera was never a political animal. In fact, people say he was a traitor to the nation. But when you look at Aguinaldo, the Filipinos in the beginning of American rule, makikita mo na ang difference lang talaga nila. Pardo de Tavera was very outspoken. Sabihin lang niya, hindi kaya ng mga Pinoy. At wala siyang pakialam doon. Ang mga politicians, let's just say, Pardo de Tavera, to at least explain how he is or how he was. Let's say, Pardo de Tavera would tell you, you have no right to speak. Let's just say, sabihin niya yun sa'yo, diretso. So, maiinis ka, di ba? Matatakot ka. Yung mga kasabayan niya, sasabihin nila, yung sinasabi mo, hindi masyadong maganda yan. Kasi parang ang gulo-gulo. Parang hindi ka mabait dyan. Kaya, pwede ba, wag ka na lang magsalita. So, syempre, these are two different ways of saying the same thing. But Pardo de Tavera, hindi siya magle-labor. He will tell you, you have no freedom of speech. Itong isa, ika-couch na yon in a more compassionate way. Pero sa totoo lang, mas complicated yun. Kasi parang dami pa niyang hinihip na guilt sa'yo. Sa Pardo de Tavera, pero ayaw natin ng ganun.
Okay. Right. So, members, kung nabubuhay ngayon, this is another question from one of our viewers. Kung nabubuhay ngayon si Pardo de Tavera, given the current political, social, cultural milieu, ano kaya ang projects na magiging inclined siyang gawin o research project na gugustuhin niyang mag-focus on?
Siguro, dahil linguistics ito, si Pardo de Tavera also wrote about Philippine history. So one of the first Philippine history, general history of the Philippines was made by Pardo de Tavera. Si Pardo de Tavera din ang nagsabi na tayo ay yung peopling of the Philippines way before Otley Bear had articulated it. Inexpress na yan ni Pardo de Tavera. Then before I learned in school, in college, that Philippine history, the beginnings of Philippine history can be traced to the Spanish chroniclers who did not write about the Philippines, but wrote about the Philippines for Spain. When I learned about that, and when I read about Pardo de Tavera, I realized he was the first to have said that. So, ang dami mong madidiscover sa kanya. But, because this is a Department of Linguistics, if there is one project, sasabihin ko medyo controversial din to. If there's one project that Pardo de Tavera would have probably wanted to accomplish, and knowing him, he would probably be able to do so, it would be to put a rest to the saga of the national language. I think. Kung meron man talagang gagawin. So, kailan ba itong kanyang Antigos Alphabetos 18? Kailan ba to? Naku, more than 100 years na. Tama, di ba? I remember, nag-150-year anniversary na 100-year anniversary na yata, centenary na yata si Pardo de Tavera. So, kung meron man siyang itutulak for the linguistics department, sa tingin ko, yun.
Naku, mukhang magiging...
Hindi ko lang alam kung English o Filipino, pero surely, itutulak niya yun. Itutulak niya yun.
At sa tingin ko, mukhang magiging controversial nga yung magiging position niya dito sa usapin na ito. No?
But knowing Pardo de Tavera, I think magagawa niya yon. Kasi wala pa siyang sinisimulang proyekto na hindi niya natatapos. At single-handedly to kasi Pardo de Tavera, he was such a really an amazing individual. Naniniwala kasi siya na to have the freedom to do what you want and to say what you want, you have to have the money for it. Mayaman siya May ganun din siyang angle. Kaya, yung kanyang mga proyekto, most of the time, sariling funded ito. Except for Planta's because that was commissioned by the Spanish government.
Okay, since we're talking about rediscovering Pardo de Tavera, we have this question from Sandra. Nasa YouTube, nanonood siya sa YouTube. Why are the works of Filipinists like Pardo de Tavera not very well known? And how can we increase Filipinism globally, especially within the Filipino diaspora?
Well, to begin with, because of how Pardo de Tavera is being portrayed in Philippine history, his work, he will seldom be cited or studied. In fact, when I this talk on Pardo de Tavera by linguistics, as you know, is a 10-year development project. Because ever since, I would always ask linguistics, "Come on, can you make me do this?" And it took me about 10 years. Siguro kasi 10 years in the making anniversary ng linguistics. So, but I discovered Pardo de Tavera because of my work on medicine. But otherwise, his work is difficult to popularize. Already, he's marginalized because of who he was and his position. And if you are not into the more serious, paano ba sasabihin? Hindi ako mukhang Pardo de Tavera dito. If you need to have a particular kind of mindset to discover Philippine history and discover Pardo de Tavera. But it is not a difficult thing to do. You just
Mhm.
have to commit yourself to it. Ang dami namang libro eh.
Mhm.
So how to popularize it? I think it begins if if the students of Philippine
Mhm.
history or Filipino students in general decide to make a commitment
Mhm.
to discover the Philippines for themselves. I
Mhm.
think dyan pwedeng magsimula yan.
Yung mga nanonood sa atin ngayon sa Facebook at sa YouTube, meron na silang pwedeng gawing topic, no, for their future papers sa mga history courses nila. Okay? Um, we have this question naman, pero hindi siya nagpapakilala. May instance po ba na si Tavera ay nagkaroon ng same sentiment sa American rule, kagaya ng pagpuna niya sa Spanish policies regarding works tungkol sa identity ng Filipinos or knowledge produced sa mga Filipino?
Teka, ano ulit?
Mhm.
Sorry ha.
Okay. May instance kaya po ba na si Tavera ay nagkaroon ng parehong sentimiento sa American rule, kagaya ng
Oo,
pagpuna sa Spanish policies?
kaya malungkot din yang si Pardo de Tavera eh. Kasi, he never really, when we all grow up, when we are part of a community, we are taught to compromise,
Mhm.
to make things work. But Pardo de Tavera, ang kanyang mga, his undertakings, he never compromised, even for
Mhm.
one bit. He, when you look at his history, Pardo de Tavera's father died very early.
Mhm.
His uncle was exiled because of the Joaquin Pardo de Tavera chose to live in Paris because he was prevented from coming back to the Philippines because of his involvement in the 1872 Cavite Mutiny. So yung
Mhm.
family ng Pardo de Tavera, anti-Spanish yan. That is the world of Pardo de Tavera.
Mhm.
Um, but it was not that that his work, he deliberately sought to be an anti-Spanish in his work. It
Mhm.
was just that he wanted to portray to to show what the Philippines was
Mhm.
without the bias of Spanish scholarship. In the manner of doing that, he became anti-Spanish.
Mhm.
You do not really understand him. You would say he set out to be anti-Spanish. Probably, but not really. It was
Mhm.
just that his mission to study the Philippines made it appear that he was consciously being anti-Spanish. So
Mhm.
when the Americans came to the Philippines, he was already telling them, I am pro-American. I believe that the American way of life will be good for the Filipinos.
Mhm.
But over time, the Americans could no longer deal with him.
Mhm.
He
Mhm.
never the Americans one major policy the Americans implemented in the Philippines was taxation, and Pardo de Tavera opposed it. From that time, the
Mhm.
Americans slowly distanced themselves from him. So, in a way, Pardo de Tavera, he in the first decade of the 20th century, he occupied a very influential position in American ruled Philippines.
Mhm.
Eventually, he was let off. He was made to go because he was like, this is my reading of it. They could not control him.
Mhm.
Other Filipino politicians were easy to deal with, but not Pardo de Tavera.
Mhm.
So,
Okay.
was he critical about the Americans? Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
No.
It did not diminish, though, his faith in science and reason
Mhm.
and his faith in the Americans. Although, probably, if he lived longer than 1925,
Mhm.
would see the Americans for who they really were or
Mhm.
are. But he died in 1925. So, not enough time for him to probably think about his initial positive attitude or optimism about American rule in the Philippines.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. Let's talk about the traditional plants and medicine. We have a question from Karma Tutob Hugne. So was Pardo de Tavera's interest in local plant names linked to that observation about Hispanic dominance over print? And is there a way to think about Filipinos in 1892 to 1905 respond to this knowledge of local plant names compared across regional languages?
Was Pardo de Tavera's interest in local plant names linked to that observation about Hispanic dominance over print? I am not so sure.
Mhm.
But again, when you go back to the motivations in all of Pardo de Tavera's undertakings, it was always to discover the Philippines, to portray the Philippines and Filipino ways of life, devoid of
Mhm.
any racial bias.
Mhm.
So I don't know, not for sure, if Plantas Medicinales was a response to that to about Hispanic dominance over print. I am not so
Mhm.
sure.
Mhm.
Is there a way to think about res- how Filipinos respond to this knowledge of local compared across regional languages? What do you mean? Is there a way to think about Filipinos in how they respond? I suppose all the texts that Spanish missionaries wrote about Philippine plants since the work of Alsina in 1664 down to the work of Blanco in 1888 were all carried local names of plants,
Mhm.
of medicinal plants. And that feature or aspect of plantas medicinales is does not deviate from that standard, if that is how we will describe it. But how did Filipinos respond to this knowledge of um let me cite a work I read about the development of botany in China. The
Mhm.
development of botany in China, and I will relate it to this work and to the question. The development of botany in China reached a point where the Chinese scholars never wanted to conform to the Linnaean system of taxonomy because they thought they have an entirely their own system of plant naming is as good as the Linnaean system. But eventually they realized that the Linnaean system works because it is based in Latin. Latin is a dead language. It will never grow, so we will never be confused. It's flat out the same everywhere. And it will never it will not lead to any confusion. But what they did was to record their medicinal plants in the Linnaean system and to include their own local names, as in the case of Plantas Medicinales de Filipinas. I don't know how Filipinos responded to that in the 19th and in the beginning of the 20th century. But now in the 21st century, in the period when the linguistics people probably can understand this more than I do, when we are faced with the reality of endangered languages and languages that are dying, the vernacular or the local plant names, along with the botanical descriptions and photos, are very useful. And Pado de Tavera probably never realized it. Very useful in helping us understand, locate, or identify resources that may no longer be available today.
Mhm.
For instance, in a work by by a group of scientists, I don't remember the exact detail, but they showed that the loss of knowledge brought about by the loss of language
Mhm.
is even bigger than the loss of knowledge that is brought about by the lack of the specimen in the
Mhm.
case of local plants. So,
Mhm.
in this regard, the work of Pardo de Taveras, Plantas Medicinales de Filipinas, becomes even more significant
Yeah.
in the 21st century.
Mhm. thank you for bringing that up. No, the significance of Pardo de Tavera's work, especially on this issue on language endangerment. Okay, so before we conclude, okay, our discussion, we'd like to acknowledge the presence of Mara Pardo de Tavera. She's watching us right now, and perhaps we can also promote your book. That's Traditional Medicine in Colonial Philippines. And tama, right? Baka pwede natin i-promote yung sa Reader's Choice.
See,
Okay. So yeah, so Dr. Planta's Traditional Medicine in the Colonial Philippines. So saan to available, Mers? Sa UP Press? Or, sorry.
wala na siyang kopya. Parang ubos na. Pero hintayin nyo na lang po. Parang may reprint. Hindi pa po
Mhm.
available yung reprint. Pero
Mhm.
naubos na yan. In the first, probably 2018, by 2019 wala na. Na-happy din ako. Parang 2020 pala.
Mhm.
Hindi na nasundan. Anyway.
Okay. Okay, so we're ending our discussion there, Mers. And to formally end or close our event this morning, I'd like to call the chair of the UP Department of Linguistics, Professor
Ito
María
electric.
Cristina Gallego.
Ayan. Thank you, Chummers, Ma'am Mers Planta. That was a very insightful talk and discussion on a controversial figure. And I personally learned so much about the first chairperson of our department and how he contributed to research on Philippine languages. So in behalf of the UP Department of Linguistics, I would like to extend my deepest gratitude, first and foremost, to Professor Mers Planta for delivering this lecture. And while she is not a faculty of the department, she is a very good friend. And while this lecture is more of more historical in nature than linguistic, it is a great way to emphasize how much insights can be gained from exploring the connections between the fields of linguistics and history, and by grounding linguistic knowledge in their historical context. So this is especially relevant, most especially during this time that is of utmost importance to have a strong and nuanced understanding of the past. So thank you to our institutional partner, Filipinas Heritage Library, headed by Dr. John Labella, for co-organizing this event and for providing some of the wonderful images from their holdings that we have just seen in the presentation. I am very much thrilled that we have established this connection, and hopefully we can continue the partnership through future collaborations, especially as we celebrate our centennial anniversary. Thank you also to Dean Bernadette Abrera for the very insightful opening remarks and for emphasizing the role of the department not only in UP but also in the country throughout the years. So to close the event, I would like to award the Certificate of Appreciation to Dr. Mers Planta for delivering this lecture entitled Man of His Time, Man Ahead of His Time, Trinidad Pardo de Tavera, 1857 to 1925, Premier Filipino Filipinist, as part of the Linguistics Special Lecture Series organized by the UP Department of Linguistics and the Filipinas Heritage Library. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right, so that's it for today. For the details of the upcoming events and activities in commemoration of the centennial anniversary of the department, you can check our official social media accounts. On October 17, we have the Linguistics Graduate Students Colloquium featuring the Kubar Research Grant Awardees. And watch out for the Pardo de Tavera virtual exhibit launch. Okay, so for those who are tuned in, kindly accomplish the evaluation form in the comment section to let us know how you have found our event today and help us improve our future events and activities. You will receive your certificate of participation after answering the evaluation form. And take note that the form will be open until 5 p.m. today, September 29th. So thank you for joining us this morning. Keep safe.